Hi, my name is Amon, and I'm a Kavli Fellow at Stanford. I'm going to talk about recleansing, starting with a very brief background, but I refer you to Ami Choi's talk for a more detailed overview of the field. Specifically, I'll use two projects, Lensing Without Borders and the Dark Energy Survey, to cover some of the main challenges that recleansing surveys face, and how I think that we, in the Dark Energy Survey's Year 3 analysis, have overcome them for really robust cosmology constraints. Jumping straight into the introduction. When the light of a background galaxy passes by a massive foreground structure, it feels the gravity from that structure, and its light path gets spent along the way. Now, as a result, the image of the background galaxy appears distorted. It is magnified, shifted, and sheared. Now, light from distant galaxies that pass by the same foreground structures acquire a coherent alignment, or their observed shear is correlated. Now, in a recleansing analysis, we measure the correlation of the shears, and it tells us about the matter distribution in the foreground, or that the light passed through. To do recleansing, we need, first, from our yellow toy galaxies here, their positions and a measure of their shapes. So we quantify these in terms of ellipticities, E1 and E2. We compute the Shear two-point correlation functions between shapes within an angular radius of theta, and that gives us psi plus or minus. Now, to model our signal, we need to understand how far away the galaxies are. So we measured the redshift distributions of the galaxies in our sample. On the right shows the Shear two-point correlation functions as a function of theta on the x-axis, measured with all of the galaxies in the Dark Energy Survey's Year 1 sample and the best fit model. So a larger signal on the y-axis means more lensing or more correlation between the shapes of galaxy pairs. Now, to maximally extract information, we do our analysis tomographically or in Redshift bins. So in reality, we don't measure the correlation function of our entire sample as here, but of pairs of galaxies within the tomographic bins and across tomographic bins. So the correlation functions are directly related to the underlying structure of the universe. They're particularly sensitive to omega matter, the amount of matter, and the clumpiness of that matter, or the amount of structure quantified by sigma 8. So usually we combine these to give this S8 parameter. Now, doing our analysis tomographically allows us to probe the evolution of structure with Redshift, and therefore to understand dark energy. It's a particularly exciting time for lensing. The first lensing surveys are complete, and 3 experiments have ongoing analyses delivering independent recleansing measurements right now. So here I'm showing the most recent cosmological constraints from these 3 recleansing surveys and their sky footprints in the map. So on the left, the brand new KIDS 1000 analysis shown in pink on the map, their footprint shown in pink. And you'll hear more about these in talks from Catherine, Benjamin, and Angus. In the middle, HSC, and its footprint is orange on the map. And on the right, the Dark Energy Survey's Year 1 analysis with the Year 3 footprint shown in green on the map. So curiously, what you can see here is that these state-of-the-art lensing surveys consistently measure cosmological constraints with slightly lower values of omega matter and sigma 8 than the Planck CMB measurements report. Now, this tension is not of the significance of the Hubble constant dispute, but the persistence of the trend is intriguing, and it does warrant some scrutiny of our lensing analyses. That's exactly what Lensing Without Borders was designed to do. So I started the Lensing Without Borders cross-survey collaboration with Alexei Liotto to test the consistency of all the lensing datasets and to potentially detect any unknown systematics or uncalibrated systematics. So we crafted this end-to-end test of the galaxy-galaxy lensing signal of boss galaxies as measured by all of the recleansing surveys. Now, the crux of this test is that the measurement of delta sigma, or the excess surface mass density, only depends on the lenses or the boss LRG properties here. and it is independent of which lensing survey that you use to make the measurements in the absence of systematics. So each team made their measurements in 4 bins, and in the top plots, I'm showing the result from the lowest redshift case. On the left, it's the measurements of delta sigma as a function of the physical radius and the different colors of the different surveys. And then I fit an amplitude to each of the signals, and the scatter of the amplitudes is shown in the plot on the right. So overall, we find consistency. The scatter in the measurements with their statistical errors shown here is consistent with the level of systematic error reported by the lensing surveys. And this is just the first type of this analysis. With growing precision of surveys, this framework is really important to do further empirical investigations and detect any residual or uncalibrated systematics. And these types of cross-survey collaborations prove to be really useful in figuring out what has to be done. So while the lensing surveys the results are consistent, and even more so when you fold in the team's reported systematic errors shown in the dotted error bars in the lower plot, we did find one slight trend, which is that the lensing amplitude varied with the lensing survey's depth, or z-source. Now this spotlights redshift calibration, but also maybe blending as leading systematics. That brings me here. So these are 3 of the main challenges faced by lensing analyses that I'd like to highlight. And I'll summarize the approach of the DES Year 3 analysis to tackle these concerns and ensure that the cosmology that we deliver in the end is absolutely bulletproof. So first, redshift calibration. That's answering the question, do we measure unbiased redshifts of our galaxies? On the other side of the data, there's the shear calibration and the impact of blending. So how well do we actually measure the shears of our galaxies? And finally, I'll comment on our leading systematic on the modeling side, intrinsic alignments. How well do we understand the alignment of our galaxies in the absence of weak lensing? So redshift methodology really came under scrutiny over the last couple of years. Now, why is this challenge so difficult? Photometric surveys don't get beautiful spectra for each galaxy, like the black lines shown in the figure. Instead, you get observations in just a few photometric filters. So with these limited observations, there's a huge amount of degeneracy between the galaxy redshift and type. So in the example shown in the plot, if I only had RIZ observations of those 2 galaxies, the redshifts would be indistinguishable. Now for the DES Year 3 analysis, these are 3 of the cornerstones that I've listed here that we believe are crucial to robust redshift calibration and that we build our methodology upon. Taking the first one, mitigate biases in the color redshift relation due to selection effects or photo Z outliers. So if the sample that you use to inform your redshifts is biased, then the color redshift relation of the lensing survey is biased, leading to biased inferred redshift distributions and biased cosmology. So there are a few options for which sample you can use as your training set, but neither of them are perfect. So narrowband photometric surveys like Cosmos 30 and POW are complete, but they may have redshifts that are inherently biased. But spectroscopic redshift samples, on the other hand, suffer from selection biases, which are really complicated to understand. So to get around this, we incorporate information from all 3 of these samples, and we let their differences span our uncertainty in that choice. Now, another thing that's really important is that the DES deep fields are absolutely crucial to this analysis. So these fields, though small in area, have overlapping near-infrared data that allow us to break that redshift type degeneracy and limit the biases in our color redshift relation. So DES doesn't have the beautiful 8-band data over the entire footprint like the kids Viking data, but the deep fields and the methodology that we've developed have gotten us around that. And this method is directly applicable to future surveys that are in similar positions like the Rubin Observatory. Next, one must characterize the full uncertainty of the redshift analysis. So our Redshift methodology, StompyZ, is based around self-organizing maps, similar to the kids team, for example. It accounts for sample variance, analytically computed. It also accounts for photometric calibration uncertainties, and we estimate an uncertainty on the method derived by running the analysis hundreds of times on our cosmological buzzard simulations. So traditionally, analyses would compute an estimate for the error budgets as a shift on the mean redshift of each tomographic bin, and use that to define a systematic prior, which is marginalized over in the cosmological analysis. Now in DES 3, to encompass our uncertainties, we take a different approach. We derive realizations of our redshift distributions, and these encode uncertainties in higher order moments. So then with a tool called HyperRank, shown at in the green at the bottom, we sample over the realizations in the MCMC, and this allows us to capture more than just the error on the mean of each redshift bin. Finally, it is common practice for lensing surveys to cross-check their redshift distributions with alternative methods, such as clustering redshifts. So in DES 3, we go the step further of combining the information of these methods. So going down the right-hand side of the flowchart now, we use our overlapping lens or low redshift catalog to measure the small scale Shear position and position correlation functions. And this gives us additional likelihoods from Shear ratio and clustering redshifts to use in our analysis. So first, we assess the consistency of these methods, first on the buzzard simulations and then on the data before deciding to combine them in our analysis. Now, as is clear in this diagram, this new Redshift methodology, led by a student that I co-advised with Daniel Gruen, Justin Miles, the methodology is complex and multifaceted and the work of a hefty team. So I point you to Giulia Gianni's talk for more details on these methods. But I hope that with this high-level view, I've convinced you that we've taken on board all that we've learned in the last couple of years, and the Redshift distributions that we've come up with are really very robust. So next, I turn to systematics in calibrating the shares that we measure. So in particular, whether we are properly able to account for the impact of blending or overlapping sources in crowded parts of the sky, as depicted here. And this is just an unavoidable consequence of having deeper data. So lensing surveys rely on image simulations for understanding how well can we estimate the shares of our galaxies. In DES, we prioritized image simulations that are well matched to the data. It was important to us to have multi-band image simulations so that we could run our entire redshift analysis on the simulations. And then that helps us capture the correlation between redshift determination and Shear estimation on those uncertainties. And finally, all of this enables us to model blending as a redshift dependent effect and propagate the impact of blending all the way to our cosmological parameters. So I'll say a bit more on that. Now I'm showing the properties of the image simulations compared to the DES data. So split by tomographic bin, showing up in the different colors. So these simulations are really in exceptional agreements in the data, in the shape properties and signal to noise, magnitude and color distributions, and redshift. And that's really a testament to the huge amounts of work done by the image simulation team led by Neil McCran. With these crucial advancements, we can quantify the impact of blending on our redshifts, which turns out to be a pretty important effect. So to do this, we artificially share subsets or Z slices of galaxies in a simulation, one at a time, and compute the mean Shear response of the galaxies in a particular slice. So for this Z slice, we detect a non-zero response in the mean Shear, even when the additional Shear is applied to other Z slices. So saying that in a more coherent way, there is a non-zero response of the measured Shear of objects in one redshift interval to an applied Shear in another redshift interval, showing that this blending effect is really more complex than we previously model it as, and it makes it really hard to disentangle the impact of blending on Shear versus Redshift, and perhaps limited to encapsulate the uncertainty due to blending solely as a Shear calibration effect. So for DESIER 3, it warranted modeling our uncertainty due to blending as an effective redshift distribution, which we can then easily propagate to our cosmological parameters and use that to assess the impact of blending on cosmology for the first time. So changing gears to one of our main systematics on the modeling side, intrinsic alignments. So we measure very tiny statistical alignments of galaxies for cosmic Shear, and we want to extract this signal that is only due to weak lensing. So that requires having the ability to model the intrinsic alignments of galaxies, so the alignments that happen in the absence of weak lensing. I won't go too far into the details here, and this is really a toy model, but there are 3 types of alignments represented by each of the boxes here. The cosmic Shear signal that we're after is the GG term. The correlations are solely due to weak lensing there. But intrinsic alignments can be separated into the GI and the II terms, and they're in parts the result of tidal alignments due to the galaxies residing in similar regions of large-scale structure and interacting locally. So the alignment, if not modeled carefully, masks as a cosmic Shear signal. Now the challenge here is that observations show that our traditional model works well on large scales and for low redshift bright red populations, but on small scales and for bluer lake type galaxy populations, those that dominate our weak lensing samples, the model is less well understood. So in DESIER 3, we want to make sure that our modeling choices are conservative and flexible enough to suit the galaxies in our data sets and to encompass our uncertainty here. So previous analyses assume that the nonlinear alignment model, or NLA, which models intrinsic alignments as linear in the tidal field with a nonlinear power spectrum, either allowing for redshift evolution, as was the case for DESIER 1 and HSC, or fixing it, as KISS 1000 did. And in the upper plot, you can see that the impact of some of these choices on S8 for the DESIER 1 analysis was important. So it's important, your cosmology parameters are sensitive to how you model your intrinsic alignments. Now in DESIER 3, our fiducial analysis uses a more conservative model, which we call TAT. So this is a superspace to the NLA model that accounts for the tidal talking effect of intrinsic alignments. So to test this modeling choice, we conducted simulated analyses with fake data that include intrinsic alignment signals modeled by both TAT and NLA models. And then we test if our 2 models can recover an unbiased cosmology on the 2 data vectors. So the intrinsic alignment signals injected were based off of Samaroff et al.'s Y1 intrinsic alignment measurements when splitting the galaxies by color, as shown, a plot from his paper shown on the right. Now in the specific test case, the NLA model was found unable to recover the true cosmology, and that's shown by the green contours in the bottom figure. So note as an aside that substantially biased contours can appear artificially smaller because they're running up against the prior edges of other parameters. That's why the constraints look so small. But it's important to stress here that the failure of NLA is highly dependent on the parameters that you put in, the TAT parameters that you put in, or the level of intrinsic alignments present in your data. But that these injected IA signals that we used are consistent with direct measurement limits from other analyses. So we cannot ignore the uncertainty of intrinsic alignment modeling. And this test demonstrates quite how detrimental limiting the analysis to the NLA model can be. So using the TAT model results in a loss of constraining power that's roughly demonstrated by going from the red contours in that plot to the wider blue contours. But this is a conservative choice that we've chosen to make for our DESIER 3 analysis, using the TAT model as our baseline to ensure that the cosmology constraints that we get out are totally unbiased. Now, where are we now? After all of our checks and selections for good galaxies, our final catalog is frozen and it spans more than 4,000 square degrees and contains more than 100 million galaxies. Our cosmic Shear 2-point function measurements are computed, they're still blind here, and they're overplotted on the yellow shaded region of the Y1 error bars, so showing quite how impressive the statistical power of the lensing data set has grown to be. On the right, I show a simulated result of the expected gain in constraining power relative to year one and the Planck constraints, and of course, randomly centered here. Now, with the DES data boasting such precision capabilities, we are being super careful in accounting for systematics and in our modeling choices, ensuring bulletproof cosmological constraints at the end. We're really at the stage of dotting our I's and crossing our T's, so stay tuned. And I just wanted to add by saying that the Dark Energy Survey is this truly large and international collaboration, and the work that I've shown here is by no means my own, but the product of many people's many years of work. So